Hello, bookish people. I'm Allie, and I am going to be talking today about genres. So, once or twice a month, I want to start doing fictional genre chats. There are 7 notable genres in fiction, and those are fantasy, romance, sci fi, crime, horror, inspirational, and western. Under all of those are subgenres, which I'm going to go into detail about in each of my genre chats. Also, it's important to note that there are children's literature books, middle grade literature, and young adult literature, but these are classified, individualized under each category. So I'm going to talk about the subgenres of fantasy, and I'm going to give some recommendations in each subgenre. To begin with, I'm going to talk about some children's fantasy. Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. Pretty much anything by Diana Wynne Jones is going to be fantasy. She is an incredible author. Howl's Moving Castle is such a good book. It follows the main character, Sophie, as she encounters the Witch of the Waste and then has a curse put on her. It's about her story and where she ends up going. This is a wonderful fantasy book. It's actually a trilogy. This is the first book of the trilogy, and I do highly recommend this. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Alice in Wonderland. This is a classic fantasy book. This is considered children's fantasy as well, and this particular cover happens to be the Disney cover, which I fell in love with. I found this at a used bookstore. It follows Alice, and you get the idea that she has fallen asleep and gone into this kind of magical alternate reality where things are nonsensical, and she goes on this kind of crazy adventure to find her way back home. So this is different than the Disney movie, but it is such a cute read, and it is very quick read. Another author that I really enjoy is Brian Jacques, who I believe it's Brian Jacques. That's how I've always pronounced it, but he wrote all of the Redwall books. This is the first one in the series. There are so many in this series. These are all following little woodland creatures that go on adventures, and they have some of the most incredible descriptions of food and drink in these books. The next book is The Iron Ring. This book was written by Lloyd Alexander. Lloyd Alexander is one of my absolute favorite children's authors. This book is about Tamar. He is a prince. He has a mysterious person who shows up in the middle of the night who seems to be of royalty. So in his culture, they have to let people in who are royalty. He ends up gambling with him, and he loses. So he's supposed to be in debt for servitude to this other king. So it's Tamar's story about upholding this promise that he's made to this other king and his journey to this other king's kingdom, and it is such a good story. I really enjoy Lloyd Alexander's writing style. I've read this book so many times that this is like literally falling apart. So I highly recommend anything by Lloyd Alexander for fantasy, but this one especially. The last recommendation for children's literature is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Anything by Roald Dahl is going to be so good. He is superb at writing children's fantasy. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is one of my particular favorites, and it follows Charlie, who gets accepted into Willy Wonka's factory, and he goes on this very odd adventure in the factory. Definitely check this one out. Okay, the next book I'm going to talk about is one of my all-time favorites, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or the Philosopher's Stone. Harry Potter is considered middle grade fantasy, and of course, I'm sure that you've probably heard about Harry Potter. It's everywhere. Harry Potter follows a boy who gets accepted into a wizarding school when he thinks that he has this average, normal, just terrible life, and he gets whisked away into this magic community. So I love Harry Potter. I'm sure that you've heard of Harry Potter. I can't imagine that many people have not. So highly recommend this one. Another book that I'm going to recommend from middle grade is Nightmares. This is actually by Jason Segel and Kristen Miller. This book caught me by surprise. This is the third book. I accidentally picked up the third book instead of the first one. I have all 3. These books are really good. They follow Charlie, and he is dealing with loss because he's lost his mom, and his dad has remarried, and he's trying to cope with that, and he's having really bad nightmares to the point that he's afraid to sleep. And when his new stepmom comes in, he starts imagining that she is causing his nightmares and that she's an evil witch. So it follows him in his nightmares and what he's going through with the adjustment to his new mom. And it's just a really good story. All three of these are really good. The next book is Midnight for Charlie Bone by Ginny Nemo, I believe. Nemo. These follow Charlie Bone, and he has a talent where he can hear people in pictures speaking, like as if he's there. And so he ends up getting sent to a magic school where he's supposed to learn about his magical abilities and how to hone them in. And he gets caught up in some odd scandals going on with the school. This is a long series. I don't know exactly how many there are, but these are all really good books. They're very similar to Harry Potter. Okay, I'm moving into some young adult fantasy books. The first book that I would recommend from young adult fantasy is The Vampire Diaries. This is a 4-book series, and I do recommend the older books as opposed to the new reprintings. They're by L.J. Smith, and this is the first one. It's called The Awakening, and these follow Elena, Stefan, and Damon, where she kind of gets involved with a vampire circle because she may be actually related to an ancient vampire. It's very, very interesting, and the story is really good and absorbing. I like all 4 of these. They continued on with the series not too long ago because of the TV show. I recommend just reading the original 4 and following this story. I didn't think that the newer ones that were printed were very good. You may enjoy those, but personally I just thought that they tried too hard to continue the story. The next book is Beastly by Alex Flynn. This is a retelling of Beauty and the Beast in modern time. Alex Flynn does a lot of retellings that are based off of traditional fairy tale stories, so these are really good books. Another book that I consider to be bridging the line between young adult and adult fantasy is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I think this could go either way personally. This book is incredible. I read this book so fast once I started it. This follows Celia and Marco as they have kind of this magic battle of sorts, and it all takes place in this magical circus. This book will wrap you up in magic and mystery and just take you on an incredible journey with some very interesting characters and such a sweet story. I highly recommend Erin Morgenstern. Now I'm going to go into other subgenres, but I'm going to primarily focus on adult. Okay, the first subgenre is dark fantasy, and dark fantasy combines elements of fantasy and horror in order to unnerve or frighten its readers. The first book I have is Something Wicked This Way Comes by Ray Bradbury. I really didn't think I would like this book when I first picked it up and started reading it because it is written very lyrically. It's almost like reading a poem, but once you get used to that writing style, this book will just suck you in, and you want to know so badly what happens because it's like a whirlwind. This book is crazy good. Definitely check out Ray Bradbury in general. The next book I have is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This book follows a little boy who meets a little girl who lives down the lane from him, and as soon as he meets this little girl, his life changes and kind of goes crazy for a little while. It's a very spooky read, and it will keep the pages turning, I assure you. Once I got into this, I did not put it down. I finished it in one day because it was so absorbing. I had to know what happened next. The next book is also by Neil Gaiman, is Coraline. This is considered children's fantasy, but it is dark fantasy, and it is very spooky, and it is a very good book. If your children happen to like scary stories, then this would be a really great book for them to read. Okay, the next subgenre that I'm going to be discussing is high fantasy or epic fantasy, and the definition for that is it is set in a magical environment that has its own rules and physical laws. The subgenre's plots and themes have a grand scale and typically center on a single well-developed hero or a band of heroes. So the first book is Homeland by R.A. Salvatore. This is not the first book in publication order, but this is the first book in the story order. This follows a dark elf named Drizzt and why he ends up wanting to leave the Underdark. This trilogy is set in the Forgotten Realms, and it follows into another trilogy. As a matter of fact, there are a whole lot of books that follow Drizzt. R.A. Salvatore is a superb high fantasy writer. The next book I'm going to talk about, and that'd be Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I am currently reading this, and I'm 100 pages into it, and so far this is really, really good book that follows 3 different perspectives about the city Elantris. I don't know a whole lot further than that because I don't want to be spoiled on what comes next. Mostly anything by Brandon Sanderson is going to be high fantasy because he creates his own worlds. The next book is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Of course, The Hobbit follows Bilbo, and he gets sucked into this grand adventure with Gandalf. Everyone should read this because this is the origins of fantasy as we know it today. The next books are The Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. This follows The Hobbit, and it is the story of Frodo and the ring and everything that he goes through, and it is so, so, so good. Definitely pick this up if you read The Hobbit because this continues the story, and J.R.R. Tolkien is a master at writing fantasy. The next subgenre is low fantasy. Low fantasy is set in the real world. Low fantasy includes unexpected magical elements that shock characters. So the first book is by Neil Gaiman, Stardust. This is set in the real world. It's set in a tiny little village where this guy is in love with this girl in the village, but she is just way out of his league. And so he sees a falling star, and she says, if you go get that falling star for me, then I will definitely date you. So he goes on this crazy adventure trying to get this fallen star. This is a really neat book, and I really love this book. The next book is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is set in the real world. It follows a man named Shadow who encounters all of these people who are gods. It's difficult to talk about without really giving it away. The next book is The Princess Bride by William Goldman. This book is a classic. It follows Buttercup and Wesley. It's written from the perspective of somebody who is rewriting another story, and it says that it's abridged, but it is not. This is the full story. William Goldman just has a very interesting sort of humor. This book is a very humorous read, and it's a really great adventure story. The next subgenre is urban fantasy. It is also called contemporary fantasy sometimes. It often takes place in urban settings, and the magical world tends to hide behind the normal world, and so magical creatures are generally involved. And if you're wondering, I am reading out of my notebook. The first book I have for urban fantasy is Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. This is a book that's set where a whole nother place exists in the London Underground with some crazy characters and a very odd adventure for the main character. This is just a very interesting take on urban fantasy. Another book that I don't have but is also a really good urban fantasy book would be The City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. The Immortal Instruments series is set in the city, and it has supernatural beings, and it is a really fun story to read as well. The next subgenre is grimdark, and it has an especially violent tone or dystopian theme. For this, I would recommend The Lies of Locke Lamora, which follows Locke Lamora and his friends, the little band of thieves, and it kind of goes back and forth. It'll talk about their past and then it'll talk about the present, and it's just a wild ride. It's really good. The next book is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. I have not finished this yet, but it follows different perspectives, and Joe Abercrombie is a great writer. He mostly does characterization. He doesn't do a whole lot of plot. You get the plot through the characters talking, more or less. The next one would be Fables, which uses personified animals and the supernatural to impart moral lessons. One of the best fables that I know is Aesop's Fables, and this has multiple short stories in it that are written for children that have a moral story, and they're really great to try to teach a lesson. This is a great go-to. The next subgenre would be fairy tales or folk tales, and these are intended for children. They're typically set in distant magical worlds where trolls, dragons, witches, and other supernatural characters are an accepted truth. So this would be something along the lines of the Grimm's fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen is another writer of fairy tales. I don't have any Hans Christian Andersen, unfortunately, but I do have The Beauty and the Beast, and this is considered a classic fairy tale. All of these are stories that you've probably heard before thanks to Disney movies, or maybe you've been told some of these stories as a child. The next subgenre would be superhero, which the protagonist has powers of supernatural origins. I don't tend to really read a lot of superhero stories. I have heard that Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson is a superhero story. Also, Vicious by V.E. Schwab is supposed to be about superheroes or villains. I'm not quite sure because I haven't read that book, but I've heard some about it, so you might check those out. The next subgenre is historical or steampunk fantasy, and these are set in historical period of the real world. These stories often offer an alternative version of history where magic and or supernatural creatures exist and place a strong emphasis on historical accuracy. I don't have any of these books. I used to. These might be books like Abraham Lincoln, The Vampire Slayer, or Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, or Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. Books that are set in a historical setting but have some kind of odd fantasy change to them. So this wraps up my genre chat for today. The next genre chat that I plan to talk about will be fantasy tropes, what we like, what we dislike. If you have any fantasy tropes that you particularly like or dislike, drop them down in comments below and we'll talk about those. If you were following my last video, you'll know that I did not get my reading vlog out, unfortunately. I had a lot going on with my children, so it just did not happen. But I'm going to take everything that I did film from that week and I'm going to compile it together, and I'm going to try to do a weekend reading vlog because it's going to be easier for me to get a lot of reading done on the weekends. And so I'm going to try to have that posted next week. We'll see how it goes. I'm going to give it another try. I post videos every Friday. See you next time.